Good evening, everyone. I'm Wesley Payne, president of the AIA's Nashville Society and recently retired director of the Parthenon in Nashville. We are delighted that you are joining us for tonight's intriguing lecture by Heather Sharpe. And I am prepared with my own glass of wine, although I don't intend to fling it, I don't think. However, you may wish to get your own libation and join us. Before I turn the screen back over to Katie and then to Murray and then to Heather, I want to remind you that these lectures are provided by the Archaeological Institute of America, and when they're live, they're provided by the Centennial Park Conservancy. And if you are not a member of either of those two very important and worthy organizations, I would encourage you to join. Your money goes to a great cause and supports the things that you obviously care about since you're here with us tonight. So whether you're in Nashville or from somewhere else, thank you for being with us tonight. Enjoy the lecture.
Thanks, Wesley. I'm Katie Petroli. I'm the Director of Education at the Nashville Parthenon and the Outreach Coordinator for the AIA Nashville Society. I'll be here to help if you have any technical difficulties. Feel free to type them up in the chat. I'll also be reminding you throughout that if you have questions, you are welcome to ask them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. You can also type them in the chat, and we will be monitoring those and keeping track to make sure that we have time to answer questions at the end of tonight's lecture. So feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or difficulties during tonight's symposium. Next, Dr. Lee will be introducing our speaker.
Thank you, Katie. My name is Murray Lee, and I am the Secretary Treasurer of the Nashville Society. Thank you all for joining us. Our speaker this evening is Professor Heather Sharpe, Chair of the Department of Art and Design at Westchester University. Dr. Sharpe received her PhD from Indiana University at Bloomington. She's a specialist in small bronze sculpture from Roman Greece, on which she has published extensively, including in the journal Hesperia. Professor Sharpe has received numerous awards, including Anna C. and Oliver C. Colburn Fellowship from the AIA, a Eugene Vanderpool Fellowship from the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, National Endowment of the Humanities, Summer Institute Awards, and a Pedagogy Award from the Society of Classical Studies. Her current research on the ancient Greek game of Kottabos and depictions of the game on painted Greek vases is the subject of her lecture today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Heather Sharpe.
First, I'd like to start by expressing my deep gratitude to the Archaeological Institute of America for supporting this lecture series, and in particular, the local Nashville AIA Society for their kind invitation to share my research with you this evening. I would like to convey a special thanks to Mr. James Ottaway Jr. for sponsoring this Alan Beghold lecture. Over many years, the AIA has been supportive of my scholarship and has provided me with numerous venues and opportunities to share my research, and I'm especially honored to be with you today. So I just want to really thank the AIA National Lecture Program for this kind invitation to allow me to join with you today, and just want to emphasize what great projects and publications AIA has contributed. So let me go ahead and get to the beginning of my talk. Okay. So before I talk, I would like to briefly provide a little bit of a background regarding how I first became interested in this topic. Ever since I was a graduate student studying art history at Indiana University, I primarily focused on the study of Greek and Roman sculpture, predominantly bronze statuettes found in Greece. Typically, these small sculptures depict gods, heroes, and religious devotees in often formal poses and arrangements. But I've long been intrigued with Greek vase painting of the Archaic and Classical periods, which depict a vast array of imagery, mythological and religious scenes, as well as more prosaic depictions of everyday life. As with many other scholars, I was fascinated with representations of the male drinking party known as the Symposium. And I must admit, I've long been intrigued with the drinking game known as Kottabos, which was a favorite pastime among symposium participants and was commonly depicted on Greek vases. Today, we frequently see exquisitely designed and beautifully decorated Greek vases on display behind glass cases in museums, and they appear so elegant and delicate. One has a hard time envisioning them as functional objects. And certainly in antiquity, they were used. Greek vases were designed to serve specific functions, and a considerable number of them were specifically employed during the symposium. For example, a cup known as a Kylix appears to have been used predominantly during symposia. Like many other scholars, I'm intrigued with this cup design. It's extremely beautiful in form, but it seems rather an impractical shape for a drinking cup. How did one actually drink out of these large, shallow cups? Some Kylixes are exceptionally large, and it must have been somewhat challenging to drink out of them without dousing yourself with wine. Most of these cups sort of range in size. There's sort of a cluster around 7-8 inches, a larger group maybe around 12 or 13 inches. There are some that measure as big as 16 inches, but those were probably more ceremonial or votive in function. As a graduate student, I did hear rumors of scholars who occasionally tested out these drinking cups in darkened corners of museum storerooms. And I must admit to being rather envious. Wouldn't it be amazing to actually try and drink out of one of these? Even more so, I was fascinated with the drinking game of Kottabos. How did one actually play the game? What were the targets? What was the goal? What was its purpose? Can it be compared to drinking games today, like beer pong? A few years ago, I finally had the opportunity to tackle some of these questions. My department at Westchester University had recently hired Andrew Snyder, a professor of ceramics, who rather fortuitously had just finished his MFA thesis project focusing on the design and mass production of cups. Soon after arriving at WCU, he initiated a 3D printing course and purchased a maker-bought 3D printer, which you see here on the screen. Almost instantly, a light bulb went off in my head. He could help me achieve my goal of recreating the experience of drinking out of a Greek Kylix and exploring how one might have played the game of Kottabos. I'm not an expert on Greek vase painting. Nonetheless, I enthusiastically jumped into the project. The opportunity to reenact the game was too good to pass up, not only to satisfy my own curiosity, but also perhaps to better engage my students who thought they had little in common with Greeks living thousands of years ago. This project would not have been possible without the invaluable support and expertise of my colleague, Andrew Snyder, who, perhaps a little bit leery at first, eventually became an enthusiastic participant, so much so that upon occasion, he gives up his usual work apron in favor of his modern take on a Greek hamartion. And this is a fabulous photograph, or two photographs of Andrew when he was doing a demonstration in one of our galleries. And he was really sort of inspired by these Greek cups. And so here he is in his sort of modified Greek hamartion, and I couldn't help but notice how very similar he looked to statues of ancient Greek philosophers. In collaboration with Andrew and with the aid of a number of our students, we endeavored to experience aspects of the Greek Symposium in the same way as ancient Athenians once did, although without the requisite wine. We are a state university and a dry campus at that. Before delving into a discussion of our sympodic experiments, it's worthwhile to review some information on the symposium, on the game of Kottabos, and how these two events are represented in Greek vase imagery. Greek vases have pride of place in many major museums of art and archaeology. In spite of their modest origins, these vases were made of local clay and were likely equally at home in modest and well-to-do Athenian houses. Today, they are highly collectible and are the subject of great fascination among scholars and general public alike. Some of the most well-known vases by master craftsmen, such as the Berlin painter who did the vase on the right, are notable for the exquisite design and execution of the painted imagery, while others are admired for the compelling myths and stories illustrated in red, black, and white. Many vases provide us with a glimpse of what life might have been like in ancient Greece, although one must recognize that such scenes were not meant to portray reality, but were likely carefully crafted to appeal to the taste of their primary clientele, well-to-do men, and occasionally their wives and daughters, both in Greece and abroad. Nonetheless, we do see echoes of everyday life. To judge from ancient writers and numerous depictions on Greek vases, the symposium, or men's drinking party, was one such event that occurred on a fairly regular basis. The symposium, which loosely translates as a communal drinking party, was a somewhat regimented affair. Male guests assembled in private houses in a room called an andron, literally the room or space of men, for a night of conversation, drinking, and entertainment. They did not sit at tables or stand and mingle as we do today, but rather reclined on dining couches, pleni, arranged along the periphery of an andron. And you see a reconstruction of an andron here. These dining couches were designed to accommodate 2 symposius. Thus, if an andron was equipped with 7 couches, we would expect that 14 guests could easily be accommodated. By the 5th century BC, there's archaeological evidence that andrones were relatively common in Greek houses, as demonstrated by excavations at residential sites including Athens, Eretria, Olympus, and Pella. These specialized dining rooms are easily recognizable because of their dimensions and decoration. Situated flush against the walls of the andron, the placement of the dining couches, you can see here, was fixed, and thus the doorway to the room was not centered, but slightly offset. Thus, even without room furnishings, identifying the location of the andron in the remains of a house is not difficult. It's frequently been observed that the andron was the most elaborately decorated room in the house, with mosaic floors and painted walls. The luxurious ornamentation clearly alludes to the importance of the space and the social ritual within. One of the best sources for understanding the activities of the Greek Symposium is Athenaeus, a Greek living in 2nd century AC Egypt. Athenaeus recorded wide and varied tales of feasting and drinking gathered from earlier Greek literary sources, particularly comic and lyric poets of the classical and Hellenistic periods. And he published his observations in a 15-book series entitled The Dipnosophos, The Learned Banqueters. So all of these books really concentrates on feasting and drinking. So we get a lot of information from Athenaeus. From various fragments preserved from earlier texts, Athenaeus reveals the elaborate preparations necessary before the drinking and entertainment of the drinking and entertainment activities of the symposium could take place. A libation of unmixed wine was offered to the good deity, or agathos daimon. Water was brought in for washing. Wreaths were handed out to guests, and you can see these guests here on the outside of a kylix are wearing wreaths. Further libations were made to the Olympian gods, to the heroes, and to Zeus' savior. A dessert course of bread, cheese, and honey was laid out. Egyptian perfume was poured. A slave girl readied her pipes, and the Kottabos equipment was set up. While there are suggestions both from literature as well as from base imagery that symposia could devolve into drunken revelry, symposia traditionally were carefully structured and regulated by the symposiarch, a sort of master of ceremonies. The symposiarch determined the number of craters to be mixed for the evening festivities, and also what ratio to use when mixing wine and water. So here, again, on this Kylix exterior, we have a depiction of the crater. This is where the wine was mixed with water, and then from there was dispensed to the guests. The custom of diluting wine with water was a regular practice among the ancient Greeks, for they recognized the dichotomy in what wine could provide. Nicetheus indicated that wine provided greatest good for those who use it properly, but the opposite for anyone who lacks discipline. Greeks believed that drinking wine straight was for the uncivilized and the barbaric, for example, satyrs and Scythians, and could result in madness. Thus, Greeks typically cut their wine with water. 3 parts water to 1 part wine was considered ideal, but other ratios, for example, 5:2 or 4:1, were also deemed acceptable. Also, we hear from Athenaeus that wine could be richly flavored with herbs and spices, including, and also other substances, tree resin, peppers, wormwood, capers, saffron, coriander, cumin, sage, fennel, mint, sesame, pomegranate, and cinnamon. So they would have been quite flavorful. The evening did not consist solely of drinking. The symposiarch would suggest topics of conversation, and poetry and drinking songs were performed. There were entertainers, musicians, including flute and lyre players, dancers, acrobats, as well as heterae, prostitutes, or high-class courtesans. And the guests competed with one another in a variety of games, testing their balance and dexterity, the most famous of which was Kottabos, a subject which we'll return to shortly. So here I think is a great Kylix scene that shows how lively the symposium could be. This man here, second from the left, looked like he's singing to the accompaniment of the flute girl. And then you have various members gesticulating, or this man on the far left, who is seemingly enjoying his wine from 2 Kylikes. And there, sort of on the right, you have an indication or a representation of a symposius actually playing the game of Kottabos. In Athenaeus's multi-volume work, there are frequent references to the playful, erotic, and raucous aspects of the symposium, which are often alluded to in vase imagery. However, it must be emphasized that the symposium was in fact an important educational and social institution, as demonstrated by 4th century writings on the symposium by Plato and Xenophon. At first glance, vase imagery depicting the symposium may remind us of English gentlemen's clubs or even American college fraternities, scenarios where men gather together to engage in social and intellectual discourse and to create a sense of community identity, which, upon occasion, can erupt into outlandish behavior and drunken debauchery. Here on the left is sort of the raucous end of the symposium when the drunken participants sort of exit from the andron. And I couldn't help but sort of compare it, of course, to scenes that perhaps are a little bit more familiar to us with fraternity scenes or sort of fraternity parties. However, it's important to remember that while we are often entranced by the body or aspects of the drinking party, there is an extensive body of scholarship on the Greek Symposium demonstrating that the event had a strong religious motivation and was an occasion to celebrate the god Dionysus and his gift of wine. Furthermore, it also served as an important venue for the education of Athenian citizenry. Athenian youths were instructed on political, economic, and social affairs, and the symposium provided a venue for citizens to forge bonds and friendship and reinforce group identity. The symposium, with all forms of entertainment that it entailed, drinking, singing, poetry recitations, playing games, as well as erotic enticements, dancing girls, flute girls, acrobats, and male and female servants, provided a rich tapestry of visual images from which vase painters could draw. Symposium scenes appear most on vases used during the symposium. These include craters, large vessels used to mix wine and water, psikters, a type of wine cooler, oinokoi, or pitchers to dispense the wine, and various drinking cups, including the Kylix and the Skiphos. The subject of the symposium has been extensively examined, both in literature as well as in art, and while general details of the male drinking party have been recognized, participants, furnishings, drinking vessels, and various entertainment activities, scholars often have to rely on their imagination when attempting to envision various elements of this important social ritual. At this point, I would like to delve further into the drinking game known as Kottabos, a favorite activity among symposium participants, which essentially involves flinging the wine lees or wine sediment from the drinking cup towards a target. Depictions of men and women playing Kottabos were especially favored among Attic and South Italian vase painters and are easy to discern. Participants are often shown reclining on a couch, occasionally on the ground. They extend one arm to hold aloft a Kylix, and one can easily see how the player has twined his finger through the handle of the Kylix. The wrist is then cocked so that the palm faces outward, and the Kylix is typically held level over the forearm. While rudimentary aspects of the game can be gathered from literature and vase imagery, we are less informed on some of the practicalities of the game. For example, what skills were necessary to play, and relatedly, how difficult was it to hit a target? In a desire to experience a symposium in a manner similar to those conducted by the ancient Greeks, I sought to engage through a series of experiments utilizing modern Kylix replicas in order to understand how the game was actually played and to determine what skills were necessary to play Kottabos and how easy or difficult it was to be successful. Fortuitously, the writer Athenaeus was just as intrigued with the game of Kottabos as he was with wine and gastronomy. He relates some basic details about the game, many of which were taken from passages of Attic comedies. He comments upon the game's possible origin, when and how Kottabos was played, as well as what items were offered up as prizes. The game was said to have been invented in Sicily. However, much of our evidence for the game, including vase imagery and Kottabos equipment, have been found elsewhere in central Italy and Athens. Athenaeus informs us that there were two versions of the game: Kottabos karaktos, Kottabos with a pole, and Kottabos in lakane, or Kottabos in a bowl. I always feel a bit like Dr. Seuss when I say that. So the first version, players throw the wine lees or the wine dregs remaining in their drinking cup at a Kottabos stand in an attempt to knock off a metal disc or plastings carefully balanced at the top of a metal rod. The plastings would fall, hitting a larger disc, the manes, located halfway down the rod, so that a loud clatter was made. So here you have a nice crater depicting Dionysus, the god of wine, actually playing it, and there in his right hand is a Kylix, and there is a young woman or a maenad helping to set up the Kottabos pole. And here's an actual Kottabos stand that was found in an Etruscan tomb. So here we have those three elements: the plastings, that disc that balances at the top, the manes, which is located about halfway down. The second version of Kottabos, en lakane, or with a bowl, is less thoroughly discussed by ancient authors and rarely depicted on vases. This is one of the rare examples that we have in this drawing, this red figure cut by Apollodorus. Here is perhaps a representation, or I should say, is a representation of a basin or a bowl, and in fact it's labeled Kottabos, so we know exactly what it is. And then on the right, we have a small Kylix from Corinth, showing what appears to be a young woman or a woman playing Kottabos. She holds a Kylix above her head, and she seems to be sort of aiming at this little basin right in front of her. So in this version, players toss their wine dregs at a bowl or a basin filled with water in which smaller bowls, which are called oxybapha, are floating. So the intention is to throw the wine dregs and to sink the little oxybapha, or these little bowls, so that they sink. And this here on the screen in the middle is our modern version that my colleague Andrew Snyder made for us. In Athens, Kottabos was strongly competitive, as were many of the other activities of the symposium: singing, dancing, reciting poetry, word games, as well as physical acts of balance and dexterity. Such feats became increasingly difficult as the night and drinking progressed. Not surprisingly, winners gained praise and were awarded prizes, while the defeated were jeered and sometimes required to offer up a penalty. Winners of Kottabos were awarded prizes, often referred to as kotabeia, or simply Kottabos, and these included eggs, fruit, pastries, or snacks. Even items of clothing are mentioned, perhaps offered up in the form of a bet. In a preserved fragment from Plato Comicus's Zeus Abused, Heracles plays Kottabos with a young woman. He proposes they play for kisses, while the woman's master suggests they play for personal items, her shoes against his drinking cup. And I love how in many of these symposia drawing, we often get an idea of the shoes sort of perhaps tucked away underneath some of the dining couches. There were amorous associations to the game of Kottabos. Athenaeus describes how players might dedicate their throws to a beloved. And a few Attic vase paintings contain inscriptions where players proclaim, "I toss these for Lycos," or "I throw these droplets for you, Liagros." Winners may receive kisses or the sexual attention of a slave or hetera, what might be considered a high-class prostitute or courtesan. The erotic implications referenced in Athenaeus are echoed in many Kottabos scenes. Eros, seen here on the left, sometimes appear during symposia when Kottabos is being played. In fact, here he is setting up the Kottabos stand. On the right, in the South Italian cup, a young woman is situated next to a Kottabos stand with the implication that she is the prize for a successful throw. So there she is setting up the stand, and immediately to the right is a young man who is about to play the game. The visual juxtaposition of the Kottabos stand and the intended prize, a female slave or hetera, is much more obvious in South Italian vase symmetry. And in fact, South Italian vase painters were much more likely to depict Kottabos stands in general. Kottabos stands rarely appear on Athenian vases, but an alternate target might have been a lamp or utensil stand, as is suggested by references cited by Athenaeus. It's unclear as to whether these passages indicate that a lamp or utensil stand could double as a target, or whether modifications were made to turn them into functioning Kottabos targets with a metal disc balanced on top. The second type of target, a bowl filled with floating dishes, is hardly ever seen on Greek vases. It's been suggested that vase painters either found it too difficult to convincingly depict, or they may have determined that the Kottabos target was unnecessary for understanding the story or the action. Though some of the subtleties of the game may have been beyond the skill of most vase painters, we occasionally get a glimpse of some of the more playful aspects of the game. Athenaeus preserves two passages that mention hetairai playing Kottabos. According to Ross Scaife, women might direct their Kottabos throw at specific individuals, which he interprets as a sign that the women were granted the freedom to choose their partner for the evening. Female participants at symposia, generally identified as hetairai, are not uncommon on Attic vase imagery, and in rare instances, they are depicted engaged in a game of Kottabos, and that's what we see here on the screen. One of the most intriguing vases showing women playing Kottabos is this red figure Kylix by the Tarquinia painter. Around the exterior, I should say the bottom of the vase, are four male-female couples. We see two of them here, reclining on cushions. Judging by the women's nudity, their short hair, and familiarity with the men, they traditionally have been identified as hetairai, or courtesans. What interests me here is that one of the women, in fact, the only person in the scene to play Kottabos, is shown mid-toss. She makes her toss as she looks over her shoulder at her male companion, not realizing that another hetairai to the left is extending her Kylix up in the air, apparently to intercept the woman's throw, and thereby making her miss her mark or disrupt the game. A similar scenario can be found on a red figure cup by the Athenian vase painter Duris, which shows male symposius engaged in similar play. On the right, a man reclining on a kline, on a couch, with his back to us, has just tossed his wine dregs in the direction of a lampstand situated almost sort of roughly in the middle, right there, which could be the intended target, although standing nearby is a young male flute player. A man reclining on the left, wearing the Scythian cap, has raised his empty cup, presumably to intercept the throw, thus conveying to the viewer that the Kottabos player on the right will miss his target and lose the game. And I have a little bit of animation here, so you get sort of an understanding of the action. So there he is. And if you throw it, he could possibly miss it. And then the other player is sort of intercepting it, almost like sort of a catcher's mitt. So now that I've introduced you to a somewhat lengthy introduction, or provided a lengthy introduction to the Greek Symposium and the game of Kottabos, let me turn your attention to the Kottabos experiments that my colleague Andrew Snyder and I carried out with the assistance of some of our students. It's all well and good to understand the game and how it might have been played on a theoretical level, but practically speaking, how did one really play Kottabos? So before Andrew and I could even approach the task of recreating the game of Kottabos, it was first necessary to procure the right equipment, namely Kylix drinking cups. As a professional ceramic artist, Andrew could easily make clay Kylix of various sizes, but we were concerned with breakage if we were to use them for playing Kottabos. Rather fortuitously, Andrew had just started up a course on 3D printing, and his new MakerBot Replicator 3D printer, which again you see in the photograph, could easily produce smaller cups, which we could use for our experiments. So I basically gave him sort of a rough idea of what a Kylix looked like with this photograph of this Kylix in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And from that, he designed, using a software called Rhinoceros, this Kylix design. Andrew created this using this software program called Rhinoceros, and was able to produce a cup using what's called a PLA filament. It's a corn-based resin, so it's quite light actually. This one measures 14 centimeters in diameter, so it's about 5.5 inches in diameter. Actually, this is right here. This is actually sort of another version, so you can sort of see the size of it. So the small size was a consequence of the size limit of the MakerBot 3D printer, but the Kylix produced is comparable in size to some of the smaller Kylix drinking cups that you would have found in archaic and classical Greece. And so now I have a sort of a brief video clip that actually shows the MakerBot in action, the 3D printer. So let me sort of run it for a few seconds so you can see how this is actually produced. So here it is, it's sort of heating up this filament and it's carefully laying it down in this sort of distinct pattern. It looks a bit weird now because it actually has to build a framework before it starts laying out the bowl of the Kylix cup. So you can just see how it's sort of supporting, creating supports for the two handles on either side. Next, Andrew and I had to produce two modern versions of the traditional Kottabos targets. A Kottabos stand for the version known as Kottabos karaktos, which you see here on the left, is actually made from a modified lampstand. And a bowl, which is also seen in the photograph here, sort of on the left, for the version known as Kottabos karaktos, so a bowl with the floating dishes. We set up a modified version of an andron, and we began our experiments with the enthusiastic assistance of some of our volunteer students in our department. And here, again, I have a video. We actually posted it on YouTube, so you can sort of see it at length. It goes on for about, I think, 3 or 4 minutes, but we'll just watch, I think, some highlights of the clip. So let me just sort of quickly show this to you. So there's Andrew and me trying it out. And then some of our students. So not surprisingly, our students proved to be pretty adept at this drinking game. I must say that I think that the women caught on much quicker than the men, but I'll get back to that. So after sort of watching these experiments for a while, Andrew and I made some really sort of interesting observations. As mentioned by ancient authors, a player must bend one's wrist, and snap the Kylix forward in order to fling the wine dregs towards the target. And we see one of our students here, George, and actually a Greek, George Karmatsoukas, showing us his technique. And to make a successful throw, we realized that patience and control were essential. Brute force didn't result in hitting your target. And in fact, Athenaeus records that one must play beautifully and gracefully. In Zeus Abused, Plato Comicus proposed that even Heracles found the game difficult on account of his stiff form. Furthermore, we observed that when playing Kottabos, the symposium must have quickly devolved into a rather messy affair. In a traditionally arranged Greek dining room, or an andron, symposium participants recline on couches arranged along the periphery of the room, so pretty much on all four sides. And it's likely that the target of the game, either the stand or the bowl, was located in the center of the room. When playing Kottabos, it must have been common to miss the target and splatter the room, the furnishings, and even your drinking companions seated opposite you. As noted previously, Kottabos players occasionally directed their wine tosses at individuals who were designated as amorous targets. But there are also Greek literary references indicating that persons may have been spattered with wine either out of spite or by accident. And there's a wonderful quote that I have here. Oops, sorry, went a bit too fast. They tried to hit the old man's head with a barrage of Bacchic missiles. So these are the wine dregs. I myself was assigned to garland whoever hit him, offering a Kottabos as prize. In a fragment from Aeschylus's Ostologoi, Odysseus describes how during a game of Kottabos, some of Penelope's suitors repeatedly hit him in the head. Similarly, in Archaeus of Eretria's Linus, Heracles complains of the misbehavior of satyrs, who when playing Kottabos ended up breaking things and hitting him rather than the intended target. It quickly became apparent to us why andrones were one of the first spaces in Greek houses to be equipped with mosaic floors, which would allow for easier cleanup. Furthermore, given the relatively fragile nature of ceramic vessels, there also must have been a number of cups broken in the course of the evening. As we were conducting our experiments, I was reminded of an observation made by Osmond Murray, a scholar who has written extensively on the Greek Symposium. In Sympodica, a book published in 1990, he wrote, "Wine offers all the benefits of companionship. It serves as a test of character and reveals the truth. It teaches the virtues of moderation and self-control. Through a controlled exposure to danger, it entices men to virtue through pleasure." In our experiments of playing Kottabos and drinking with Kylix, the issue of moderation and self-control took on new meaning. Playing Kottabos while sober was difficult enough. After drinking 2 to 3 Kylix of wine, the feat would be considerably more challenging. Winning at Kottabos at this stage not only would provide the ancient Symposius with a victory prize, but also display his skill and control to his fellow revelers. Similarly, the use of a Kylix cup during the symposium demands a certain dexterity, whether using it for drinking or for playing Kottabos. In a state of extreme drunkenness, a symposius can more easily lose control of a Kylix, especially a large one, and end up doused with its contents. Holding a Kylix of wine requires control and balance. Intriguingly, many symposius are shown holding the cup from underneath the foot, which is, I think, somewhat different from what we would imagine. I mean, I think we would sort of typically imagine holding it by like one of the handles rather than underneath the Kylix itself. If ancient authors advocated control and moderation when consuming wine, the actions and conduct of symposius while drinking and playing Kottabos might provide the first indications of a loss of control. A symposiarch might reestablish control and direct the participants to more restrained behavior, or it may dissolve into body and violent behavior commonly associated with the komos, the sort of rowdy departure at the end of the symposium. Either conclusion was possible and to a degree acceptable. And in fact, the vase painters are often entranced or intrigued with, of course, some are the nasty results of a night of overindulgence. And so here's two wonderful vase painting scenes from the interior of a Kylix cup. So you can imagine drinking that, all of a sudden realizing what this image that is slowly revealed shows you. So it shows two men who, of course, are shown vomiting, presumably at the tail end of a symposium. According to Francois Lisserag, the symposium had a strong educational component as promoted by Plato. One comes to know individual characters in their true nature in order to be able to make them better. The extreme behavior that could erupt was acceptable within the confines of the symposium and overseen by the symposiarch. Nonetheless, moderation and temperance were frequently promoted. And there's a writer, a 6th century, 5th century BC writer, Epicharmus, who has a quote: "Drinking leads to wandering the streets drunk, and wandering the streets drunk leads to acting like a pig, and acting like a pig leads to a lawsuit, and a lawsuit leads to being found guilty, and being found guilty leads to shackles, stocks, and a fine." Before I conclude this evening, I would like to briefly digress and discuss a small group of Athenian vases that present images that don't fit in with standard symposium or Kottabos scenes, and as yet have received little scholarly attention. These vases depict women playing Kottabos, sometimes with an attendant, other times alone, and rather unusually, the action appears to take place outside the usual symposium setting. So here on the left is one of these vases showing a woman playing Kottabos, and you see the stand right in the middle. And then on the right, one of the more sort of typical symposium scenes. In the vase on the left, we are clearly aware that Kottabos is being played due to the Kylix held in the woman's hand and by the uncommon presence of a Kottabos stand. Yet this group appears quite distinct and separate from traditional symposium or Kottabos scenes that revolve around the lives of well-to-do Athenian men. And I'll quickly go through the sort of small group that I've come across. So on the left is this Attic Kous by the Fiale painter. This unfortunately is extremely fragmentary, but this is an Attic Kous showing in the middle, you can sort of barely make it out, it's very fragmentary, a seated woman, and she holds a Kylix in her right hand. There's the remains of a Kottabos stand right in front of her, and she's accompanied by a dancer and what appears to be a male servant right behind her. A mug, this one has a woman reclining on the ground, holding a Kylix cup, and there seems to be a sort of an abbreviated Kottabos stand sort of just off or right next to her feet. And then on the top of this pyxis, on the right, you have an idea of what this pyxis shape is, but the top of the lid is often decorated. And in this one on the left, shows a woman, again, seated on a chair, playing Kottabos. And there she is sort of reaching out towards a Kottabos stand, which of course is the intended target. So as we examine these scenes more closely, it's clear that the women are not participating in a symposium. That is to say, a male drinking party, as adult men are conspicuously absent, and there is little to suggest that any drinking is taking place. While the vase painters have gone to some effort to convey that while Kottabos is being played, we clearly see the Kylix and Kottabos stand, the action clearly takes place outside the usual symposium setting. Note the lack of fellow banqueters and dining couches. Rather, the women and their actions are central to the story. The women do not recline on dining couches, as was the norm for symposia. Instead, they are typically seated on a klysmos, or a chair, which conveys a certain amount of rank or status. They appear well-dressed in a company of servants, a servant boy, maidservant, flute player, and dancer, which suggests that they are situated in their own household. But who are these women? This lekathos in Berlin may provide an answer. A woman seated on a klysmos plays Kottabos, directing her throw at a Kottabos stand with a flute player placed opposite. Hanging on the wall above her, you can see it in the photograph on the right, are a pair of crotales, or castanets. Their close proximity is clearly intended. Crotales were tools of the trade used by entertainers and hetairai. Similarly, the presence of a flute player and dancers in many of the other scenes also reference the musicians and acrobats who, like the hetairai, provided much of the entertainment at male symposia. Based on this evidence, I propose that these vases depict courtesans. But how are we to interpret the fact that they are shown playing Kottabos, but are not at a symposium? We may consider that they are playing the game for its oracular function, speaking the name of a lover or prospective lover as related to us by ancient sources. The scenario is also reminiscent of ancient Greek love spells cast to capture or recapture the attention of a lover. And we have evidence of some of these ancient love spells where a woman or sometimes a man is sort of conspiring to gain the attention of a lover. So here's one, Delphus vexed me and I burned this laurel against him. And just as these laurel leaves shriek loudly as they catch fire and suddenly burst into flames, and we cannot even see their ashes, so too may Delphus completely consume his flesh in flame. You, Junks, drag him to my house, my man. And then another one, to use Aphrodite, is dedicated Nikos Junks, this sort of spell, which knows how to draw a man from across the sea and youngsters from the women's quarters. Recently, Christopher Rone has described how Greek courtesans occasionally appropriated skills and arts that traditionally belonged to the domain of men, including casting of love spells and playing the game of Kottabos. Rone draws attention to a series of magical spells, most often used by men, but occasionally by women, designed specifically to torture and burn a past or potential lover and compel him or her to leave their home and return to the arms of the person performing the spell. In Greek literature, Eros often takes on an active and violent role in such spells by melting or burning or beating the targeted man or woman. Rone further proposes that the two vases that we see here on the screen, depicting all female symposia, which is rather rare, represent another instance of courtesans opting male rituals, specifically drinking and playing Kottabos. Ferrone appears unaware of the small group of Attic vases I'm discussing today. In both these scenes on the screen, the female banqueters call out the names of men. And both of them do have inscriptions. The one on the left, I think, is a little bit more visible. So the female banqueters call out the names of men, Euthymides and Liagros, as they make their Kottabos throw. The game was predictive. If they hit their target, they would be successful in gaining the attention and affection of the man whose name they call out. Currently, it's debated as to whether such all-female symposia would actually have taken place or whether they were fantasy scenes made for the gaze of male symposius. Ferrone proposes that the Hydria and Sictor, seen here, may have been produced for wealthy courtesans who in some respect could see themselves in competition with older men who similarly sought out the attentions of young, handsome male lovers. Other scholars, including Alison Glazebrook, suggest that such imagery was intended for a male audience who might be both amused as well as alarmed about such inappropriate female behavior. It's not my intention to enter this debate here, but it's worthwhile to consider this new group of vases of women playing Kottabos in this light. There is evidence that some courtesans were wealthy enough to gain a certain level of status and independence. Socrates visited the well-appointed house of Theodote, a courtesan who is in the process of getting her portrait painted. Theodote has the means to wear fine clothes and jewelry, hire an artist to create a portrait, keep servants, and maintain a well-appointed household. And presumably, well-to-do courtesans could also afford to purchase finely decorated pottery. This small group of Attic vases that I present here is remarkable for the unorthodox representations of women. The women engage in behavior that clearly does not belong to the realm of proper Athenian girls or housewives, nor do they fit so clearly into the stereotypical portrayals of courtesans, prostitutes, and female slaves. Rather, I propose that we are provided with a somber glimpse into presumably some of the more poignant moments of these women's lives. Are they playing Kottabos to predict the outcome of an erotic affair? Are they looking for a new patron? Or are they seeking to regain the attentions of a lover who has abandoned them? I do believe that these vases were purchased by women and were meant specifically for their own contemplation. Note the range of vase shapes within this group: Kous, Lekathos, Pyxis, and Mug. And here's the Pyxis. These are not vessels commonly used at the male symposium. The Pyxis in particular is a vase used by women, perhaps to hold jewelry or cosmetics, and as such was usually decorated with imagery pertaining to the lives of women. Could this Pyxis have once belonged to a courtesan and then placed in her grave as one of her prized possessions? I'm doubtful that such imagery would have been appropriate for a proper Athenian housewife. They seem to lead much more pedantic lives, filled with child raising and industrious household duties, such as spinning wool and weaving. However, keep in mind that such scenes are stereotypical scenes, crafted to present an ideal vision of elite Athenian womanhood. Generally missing are illustrations providing a glimpse into the everyday lives of women often overlooked. Foreigners or medics, middle and lower class women who worked, courtesans, and slaves. Many of these did not have the means or independence to leave their mark in the historical record, but it appears that some heterae had the resources to do so. We see here, however, that there is evidence, small windows that allow us to peer into aspects of their private lives. In conclusion, I'd like to emphasize that in our own deliberations of asymmetry of the Greek Symposium, we may initially dismiss the drinking party as lighthearted entertainment, characterized by excessive drinking and hedonistic behavior. However, symbolic imagery no doubt reflected and reinforced the important religious, social, and educational aspects of the symposium. As noted by Francois Liserag, in ancient Greece, wine was viewed as both poison and medicine. Consuming it unmixed or in excess resulted in violent or animalistic behavior, more in common with the uncivilized, satyrs as well as non-Greeks, such as Scythians or Celts. As promoted by Plato, wine in moderation encouraged sociability, intellectual growth, and in particular was prized for its revelatory power. Wine reveals individuals' susceptibility to weakness and their true character. In the same way, the game of Kottabos was not just a drinking game. In South Italy, it was closely tied to the cult of Dionysus, while in Athens, its competitive aspect could be compared to military prowess. Frequently, it was compared to throwing a javelin. And relatedly, it served to be indicative of achievements in other pursuits. Kottabos was similar to divination. Success in the game was predictive of amorous success. Whatever its origin, the game of Kottabos had a number of enthusiastic devotees from Athens to South Italy, and its popularity lasted well beyond the classical and Hellenistic periods. As Athenaeus has captured my attention with his tales of feasting in Kottabos, I hope that I've been successful in sparking your imagination with his exploration of vase painting, scenes of Greek symposia, and the game of Kottabos in my discussion today. Thank you. I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and hopefully you can, Katie, you can take over.
Yes, thank you so much. We have a list of questions already, but I will just verbally welcome everybody to type their questions into the Q&A or the chat. I have them kind of organized by time, but also by theme. So first, we have a clarification question here from Margot, who asks, was the andron separate and different from the usual dining room or triclinium? In other words, was it a special room just for drinking parties?
Yeah, it seemed to have been, I think, predominantly used for this this men's drinking party. I mean, I would imagine that in a Greek house, you in some respects you only have a certain amount of space. So maybe when it wasn't being used, it could have been used for other activities. And I think perhaps at Priene there is some indication that that these sort of more formal dining rooms did occasionally were utilized for maybe weaving or some other activities, but it seems specifically designed for this male drinking party.
We have a couple questions about wine dregs. You've really piqued curiosity here. I will try not to ask you all the questions at once. So, Wesley, our very own Wesley, has asked that she's wondering about the dregs that must have been left behind in the drinking cup. Do we know how the wine has changed? So should we be thinking of any dregs in our own wine?
So as far as I know, when the ancient Greeks made wine, they made it quite a bit stronger than what we are used to. I think they made it as strong as like 16%. And I think, that, and I'm not an expert, but I think, that we engage in a certain amount of purification process in our own wine, whereas there's probably like sediment that we are familiar with. I'm sure there was a lot more sediment in ancient wine. And then of course, think about all the additives that they added to the wine. I mean, there's mint, there's cinnamon, resin, of course, which is still very typical in Greek wine today. So if you're adding these herbs and spices, you would have to imagine that some of them end up sort of, clustering at the bottom of your cup, your Kylix, and you probably don't want to sort of gulp it down. And so that seems to be sort of the sediment or the wine lees that is often referenced.
All right, we have a couple questions that connect to your own research and experiments. So Margot has asked, what do you use as wine dregs and in what quantity, like a few tablespoons or even more? And there's a similar question that asks the same things. What did you use as wine dregs? And includes a thank you from the UVM Classics Club.
So sadly, one, we didn't use wine, unfortunately. I keep on thinking it would be really fun to maybe do our faculty Christmas party somewhere and try it out. So, we didn't go that route in being, so close to the ancient game of Kottabos. It's sad to say we use basically diluted Kool-Aid when we were playing on campus, and we didn't use the dregs. And I must admit that, if you look at that video, we were probably using a little bit too much liquid. You have to imagine that maybe it was like a tablespoon or two when they played in ancient times. And you can, if you look at that video, at one point, the floor seems to be sort of a wash in sort of Kool-Aid. So we weren't quite as authentic as the ancient drinkers were, but that's a good idea. I think maybe we'll have to try that, because it certainly would give a little bit more weight to the throw. But I just imagine too, if people are playing in the andron, I mean, it just must have been splatters everywhere, and it must have been quite a mess at the end of a symposium.
Our next question is from Shirley, who asks, did your research conclude if the size of the cup gave any advantage in the game? In other words, could that be one of the reasons for the larger sizes of the cups?
So in regards to cup shape, there's been some research as to what's some of the more common cup shapes. So there seems to be sort of two clusters, like maybe around 7 inches. And this one is, that sort of 5.5-inch one, which is what we were using initially in the video. And then the next sort of size up, and I really wish I could have shown you guys this in person. So this is sort of the next size up. This is about 10 inches. And there seems to be like a cluster around 12 and 13 that was quite popular. And this is perhaps one of the more sort of functional sizes. And you could drink out pretty easily out of this. It does take sort of a certain amount of control. You can't guzzle it really easily. Otherwise, I think you sort of drench yourself. And then we made one that is considerably larger. This one, I think, is about maybe 14 inches or so. And some of these you can see depicted on the Greek vases. I mean, if you sort of measure like a person's arm, they may have sort of held it sort of like this. So some of them do seem quite large. But some of the extremely large ones that are like 16 inches were probably more sort of ceremonial or votive in function. In regards to playing with this size, first of all, these are quite light. So they don't really sort of compare to the ancient ones that were made out of clay. And then of course, we also have bronze versions. So we're also sort of missing a little bit in regards to weight. But I actually haven't played with this one yet. This is actually a professionally 3D printed one. But this will be sort of on my next round of experiments. We mainly were playing with the smaller version, but I think that because of the shape of the cup, it does give you sort of a little bit of lip to help sort of like direct your throw. But I think, just the smaller ones are a little bit easier. And I'll just say one more thing. I think it's I'm trying to remember in what collection. I'll have to try and look it up. But there's a collection of some cups in Germany that are a little bit bigger than this. And they appear to have been broken around the handle and then broken and then repaired with sort of like almost gold rivets. So one idea is that they were broken while playing Kottabos, and I guess someone had their favorite cup and they had it repaired so that they could play with it again. And also, I think there's an idea that perhaps since they were non-Greeks, they sort of were quite attached to this sort of expensive import item. So hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you so much. Well, in addition to all the lovely comments and the thank yous in the chat and the Q&A, you have definitely piqued my interest and also Wesley's interest when you're talking about the all-female symposia. That kind of or drinking parties or gatherings, made me think right away of cults of Demeter, things like Eleusinian mysteries, thesmophoria, kind of gatherings. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about if any of the all-female gatherings have iconography or context that could be connected to a religious function or a cult of Demeter function at all?
As far as I know, I don't know of any Kottabos scenes or even female symposia scenes that directly relate to like a specific cult. And I think in some respects, these are sort of mystery cults. So there is this sort of there may be sort of a prohibition against showing some of these events. That's a great question. I think it would be really worthwhile to see, if there is, or I should say, where there's dining and female dining, I should say, in some of these sanctuaries, whether it would have included something like this, like a drinking game. But maybe it was a little bit too sort of frivolous to engage at a sanctuary. But I'll have to look more at some of the Greek vases and to see if there's any sort of reference to any sort of ritual or religious action. Good question.
And Wesley asks, kind of the same topic, could the courtesans be playing Kottabos to be rehearsing for their entertainment, like a practice session of sorts?
I mean, you would think that perhaps that there was practice involved, but I sort of wonder if that was it would be interesting enough to be depicted on a vase. And there is that one scene of I think it was the Hydria, where the women are shown reclining on the shoulder, and they're playing and they're calling out the name of Euthymides, of a youth. And then right underneath it is a scene of a young man who's being I think trained how to or taught how to, I think, play a lyre. And so that seems to be sort of a direct reference to Euthymides, who they're referencing. So it seems to be perhaps a little bit more serious rather than like them practicing.
I only see one final question, and it's from Marjorie. So, does modern wine have as much sediment as ancient wine?
Good question. I should look into that, because they, of course, they have amphorae, which were used for wine transportation. And I imagine they've done analysis of wine sediment. And of course, they have a series of drinking cups from, I want to say Gordion. There's actually at UPenn, I'll have to look into it, in which they have analyzed some of the sediment that remains in some of those drinking cups. So I haven't done that much research on it, but that's a great question. I would imagine that ancient wine is perhaps not quite comparable to what we have today. I think they might have done things like honey mead, where there were sort of different processes involved. So I think in some respects, it's not perhaps all that comparable to what we would experience today or we would drink today. But there is one scholar, I know, Patrick McGovern, who's done quite a bit of work on winemaking and essentially alcohol in the ancient world. So he would be a great resource to look at as well.
That is our final question. So unless there's any final thoughts so far, I can see everyone is saying, thank you, so interesting. This was fantastic. I utterly echo those thoughts. So that's it from me. Wesley, would you like to take us out?
Just thanks again. It truly is an unusual and intriguing topic, and I think experimenting with it was just brilliant. 3D printers have changed many people's lives, I think, and that's really great. Thanks for bringing us such an interesting topic.
Oh, it was my pleasure. I just wish I could have been there in person.
You'll have to come sometime.
Absolutely, definitely.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you're the first to know about all the exciting things happening at the Nashville Parthenon.